Frankenstein, stronger than Hercules, and lights a fire with a snap of his finger. Are you as good as my daddy, mister? Not if you don't visit the Gatherer's Garden, you aren't. Smart daddies get spliced at the garden.
2007 was one of the more notable years in gaming. BioShock was one of its most notable releases. It's still a wonderful title that still holds up. BioShock itself is an interesting title to look back on for the time period of which it was released. A time I consider the closing days of the golden age of gaming. While I do think BioShock 2 is the better overall title, especially from a gameplay standpoint, BioShock provided the foundation and had the larger impact. Replaying BioShock for this video, I don't feel the quality difference between the two is as large as I thought it was when I made my video on BioShock 2 a year ago. It took the foundation of its spiritual predecessor, System Shock 2, and streamlined it in a way for a larger audience that resulted in a blockbuster hit. So let's dive back into the world of Rapture. Before we begin, I want to give a big thank you to Dustandmarbles for doing the animation intro to this video. In the case of YouTube algorithm delivering the goods, I was recommended her BioShock 2 animated music video, and I was blown away. So would you kindly give it a watch and check out her other work? Card here and link in the description and pinned comment. For this video, I'm playing the remastered edition. It doesn't have any issues. I might have had one crash or so, much less than BioShock 2 when I played the remastered for that. It did have some bugs at launch with the remastered version, but it is much better than a recent remaster that happened under the Take-Two umbrella. The foundation of BioShock began in 2002, and that year Irrational Games has just shelved their title The Lost that was completed. While the game was eventually released many years later by a different studio, I did a whole video on this game, chronicling its bizarre adventure if you're interested in learning more. The best comparison I'd say is it's similar in style and gameplay to American McGee's Alice. While working on titles like SWAT 4 and Tribes, they also had a few ideas kicking around. One of them being a game system of protectors, harvesters, and drones carrying something valuable. This would eventually become Big Daddies, Splicers, and Little Sisters. Take-Two would acquire Irrational Games in late 2005. This gave them room for growth in a larger team and budget. Of course, this also brought along higher expectations. The gameplay and systems that they came up with earlier in the stages were mostly carried over. The setting itself saw a number of changes. Prior to Rapture, one idea for setting would have been in space where we'd play as a cult deprogrammer. That was a bit too similar to System Shock, so they wanted to try something different. Another was to take place in an abandoned laboratory from World War II that was recently discovered in the present day. One day when walking past the GE building of 30 Rock Plaza in New York City, Ken Levine was inspired by the Art Deco design and the statue of Atlas carrying the world. The plot would be heavily inspired by the works of Ayn Rand, especially Atlas Shrugged, with the focus on objectivism. They had the challenge of creating a game with the foundation of System Shock 2, but bringing it to a wider audience. In early 2007, as development was mostly wrapping up, there was a disastrous playtest session. This led to a number of changes happening before its release in late August of that year. We'll go over some of those points that popped up during the playtest session throughout the video. The choice that they did go with in regards to the art direction was the right choice. Rapture is instantly recognizable, especially when compared to other things coming out around this time frame. The 7th generation saw many games go the brown route, lots and lots of brown. It makes use of the Unreal 2.5 engine to stunning results, and it's a case of strong art direction that matters more in the long run over graphics fidelity. The game also has a beautiful orchestral soundtrack with many memorable tracks. So many of these kinds of soundtracks with orchestras have blended together in the last 15 years or so. Not just games, but TV shows, movies as well. So I have a little pop quiz for fans of cape shit. Hum me some of the Marvel soundtrack tunes beyond that 10-second little Avenger bit they play in all the trailers. Good luck. While the strings compositions are great, the standout is the incredible piano piece, Cohen's masterpiece. The game also makes use of a number of licensed tracks to build that atmosphere. Bing Crosby, Billie Holiday, the Ink Spots, and one of the game's most notable scenes, the classical composer Tchaikovsky. We'll be spending a fair amount of time mowing down citizens of Rapture, but we have a number of options on that front. Shooting is good, but it never felt what I would call solid. Something feels a little bit off, a bit loose. Granted, I'm the first to admit that I'm not also a great shot. However, the number of choices you have make up for it to a certain degree. For example, each gun will have alternative ammos, which I'm always a big fan of. Although mostly it's just anti-personal for splicers, armored for everything else. But there are some varieties thrown about here and there, like fire and electricity with bullets. There's a variety of weapons we'll also get here. Maybe too much if anything, so I end up kind of using the same ones over and over. Even if the first impressions of it aren't the case, the wrench can pack quite a punch, depending on what tonics you use. It can be quite deadly. We'll also have plasmids, which are the game's equivalent of psi powers from System Shock 2. So I always found myself in past playthroughs falling back to these same old patterns, so for this video I did explore a little more than usual. Sonic Boom, for example, that's one I didn't use much before, but I made a fair amount of usage of it here. One thing I really enjoy about the world of Rapture is how much time it takes to justify these plasmids in the game world. Why are these being made? Well, there's a civil war that's going on in Rapture. Plus, the little advertisements for each of these is great.
Throw objects at foes. You can even catch grenades and throw them back. Knock foes back with hurricane force. Laugh as they bounce off the wall. Freeze your enemies. Shatter them into 1,000 pieces.
Combat did take a bit to get used to here because I was falling back on BioShock 2 habits. In BioShock 2, you could use both a weapon and plasmid at the same time, while here you need to switch back and forth. Ken Levine mentioned in a tweet that dual-wielding plasmids and weapons were cut at the last minute. Tonics give us a variety of sword upgrades in combat, engineering, and physical tonics. There's a lot to choose from here, and it's easy to swap in and out. So who are these enemies we'll be mowing down? Well, mostly it will be splicers. These are citizens of Rapture who are spliced up on Adam to the point that they're quite deranged. There's a nice variety of them, and they have very memorable quotes and sound cues.
Company! We were just getting started!
The game slowly introduces new ones throughout, they have different tactics, and they will mix them together throughout the game. We'll also deal with turrets, security bots, security cameras, and of course, the big daddies, which we'll cover shortly. At one point in time development, the game was going to have limited inventory like the prior Shock titles. They pointed to the Resident Evil 4 grid system as proof that people would be fine with the system, and yet at the end of the day, it was removed and streamlined. It's one of those things I wonder if they made the right choice in doing. How would the game have been different in regards to having a limited inventory? If done right, a limited inventory can add a lot of interesting constraints and decision making to the player. I'd rather have that than, say, having all these possible weapons at once. BioShock Infinite would of course go too far and go with the 2-weapon setup. And with no inventory, our character loves to pick up everything to consume. We'll just be eating chips and cakes from garbage bins. To the point even a Gokado avocado would be like, slow down there. Smoke and drink, of course, to your content. BioShock did strip away a number of these RPG elements that were present in System Shock 2 for a more streamlined approach. One addition here is the camera system. We'll switch to a camera to take a picture of an enemy. The better your shots are, more characters, action, the more points you'll get. Further research will give you additional tonics, but also damage upgrades against enemies. One of the issues I have with BioShock is the progression of health for enemies. As we progress through the early game, enemies will go down fairly quickly. However, we'll eventually hit a point where they get a lot more bullet spongy. Of course, taking pictures to get that research helps. There's also upgrade machines throughout the world in which we could choose to upgrade an aspect of one of our weapons. It's not a huge issue, but it is something to note. Back to the camera, the idea behind it is fine, but does slow the game down at points as you have to switch to it in order to take photos. BioShock 2 made a nice improvement by making this not a photo, but a video camera. It wouldn't return as high of a score the more you use the same weapons and plasmids. To upgrade your plasmids, get new ones, get more tonics, you'll need to part with Adam. As there's not enough Adam in the game to get everything that's available, you have to be a bit choosy in what you'll end up selecting. So how do you collect Adam? Well, that leads to arguably BioShock's most well-known design choice.
Time to go, Mr. B.
If you ask anyone about what comes to mind when they think of BioShock, most will answer the Big Daddies and Little Sisters. They're an iconic design that's instantly recognizable. The design for the Big Daddy came together fairly quickly, but it was the Little Sister that went through a number of iterations. They wanted to make it a difficult choice for the player. Would they harvest them or would they rescue them? Well, the initial designs were just slugs, and who really gives a shit about what you do with a slug? So they tried other designs. One had dogs in wheelchairs. That does make the inclusion of the song "How Much Is That Doggy in the Window" somewhat amusing. Another was titled "Frog with a Funnel in Its Anus." That was dropped as well, surprise, surprise. Eventually, the idea of the Little Sisters ended up being the final design choice. There was a bit of a hand wave in the game why it could only be girls. There was an idea of adding in little brothers in BioShock 2, but that was cut. And the Little Sisters themselves went through a number of iterations. Initially, we could use a plasmid on them to reject the slug, although it wasn't clear if we were helping them or not. At this point, they weren't invulnerable, that they could be killed. The team found it could happen fairly frequently in the heat of combat. Of course, killing children gets into some very dicey territory with ratings boards and controversies, so they made the choice in the lore to make them invulnerable. One of the more fascinating aspects of BioShock is this relationship between the Big Daddies and Little Sisters. Childish nature of the Little Sisters with how they talk to their Big Daddy, or Mr. Bubbles as they refer to them as.
Thank you, Mr. B.
But if you get too close, Little Sister is going to get scared, and Mr. Bubbles is having none of that.
Keep it out from me! Keep it out from me!
There's something quite sad about clearing out a level of Little Sisters and have a Big Daddy try to find one at an event, only for none to answer. Until you open fire on the Big Daddy, they will leave you alone, and they're totally optional. However, you will miss out on that atom, and you will really want that atom. Big Daddies can take a while to go down, so you have to prep yourself beforehand. There's different kinds of Big Daddies that you'll encounter throughout the game. They'll be quite tough at first, but as you open up more options in Atom, they become pretty quick affairs. That said, they're still enjoyable to make use of the tools and the environment around you. I wasn't rolling my eyes at each one I came across even later in the game. There's also something fascinating as well with the insults a Little Sister throws your way when you're fighting a Big Daddy. When the Big Daddy goes down, we have the choice of harvesting or rescuing the Little Sister. If you harvest them, you get 160 atom, and if you rescue them, you get 80 atom. However, with every 3 that you rescue, you'll receive a gift, and with that gift, you'll receive 200 atom. You'll also get plasmids and tonics you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. So the atom difference overall ends up being about only 280 more atom if you harvest. Plus, you miss out on tonics and plasmids that you can only get by rescuing. This has been one of the major criticisms BioShock has received over the years for the system, and for good reason. Well, Ken Levine mentioned in an interview that this was a compromise with their publisher. They mostly had free reign with what they wanted to do, but they had a number of debates with the publisher on this front. Had the team got what they wanted, rescuing Little Sisters would have been very minimal in regards to rewards. So much so that would have really tempted the player to harvest more because of the large difference as a result. And harvesting really sucks. I fucking hate doing that. I feel terrible each time doing so. Hell, I didn't get any footage of harvest during this playthrough. I rescued them all. At one point in development, they also had a devil icon over harvest and an angel over rescue before cutting that out, making it a bit too obvious. I did also look up if there were any mods for BioShock. Besides visual overhauls, I did come across one that was looking to tweak the game balance. However, this was abandoned over a decade ago due to the game not being exactly mod friendly. I'm sure if there were the case, we could have seen some gameplay mods that would tweak the system to make it more like the original intention the developers had, but that's not the case. While the system of harvesting versus rescuing was compromised, everything else about the Big Daddies and Little Sisters was a complete success. Again, there's a reason they become so iconic in the medium. And save for a section later, they're not the major focus here. It's about this war going on in Rapture. The relationship between Big Daddies and Little Sisters would be explored in much more detail in BioShock 2. Along with the excellent environmental storytelling, BioShock makes use of audio diaries, continuing in the vein of System Shock. They're left by various citizens, giving insight into their characters in the City of Rapture. There are times when progressing forward that they may get interrupted by someone else talking to us, but there's a handy button to press to just let us play the last collected audio diary. Very helpful. And the hacking minigame in BioShock, yeah, it sucks. I mean, the minigame itself is fine, it just takes way too long, and you could hack so much stuff here. Vaults, cameras, turrets. I did hacking like 2 or 3 times during this playthrough, then either used auto hackers, bought them out, or just skipped them. It's so much better in the sequel, plus it doesn't take you out of the game as well and pauses the world around you. Oh, and that fucking quest arrow. This was added in after the disastrous playtest in January 2007. Playtesters said they had a hard time knowing where to go. Of course, I turned it off for this playthrough. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if some of these playtesters during this disastrous playtest were Darkside Phil and Aaron Hansen, seeing how they play games. Okay, if it's something like a open world game or something like Crazy Taxi, I could dig it, but here, it just drives me up the wall at various points over the years, seeing videos of BioShock on YouTube and seeing people leave this fucking quest arrow on. This is something that part of the design team didn't want to be included, and the game is of course totally playable without it. This is just before that period in game design where games start to be built around objective markers really started to kick in. Mention these playtests as the players found the game a bit too dark, and they did tweak the lighting to brighten up and make it more clear where you needed to go. Otherwise, I think the design wasn't changed from what I gather. There's plenty of signage around you, and you also have a map. So the gameplay gives us plenty of options, even if some of the execution is a bit lacking. That said, it's still a step above most games. In a way, it feels like BioShock 1 walked here so BioShock 2 could run. With the second title, they found the right balance of fixing its shortcomings, to adding in new things to make it a really fun experience. With that, let's go through the game itself. So spoilers from here on in, and some slight spoilers for BioShock 2, which I will note when they happen. In my list of favorite game intros, BioShock is on that list. It's one of the strongest, most confident intros to any game I've played. Which is funny because one of the biggest issues I have with BioShock 2 is its first hour is quite shaky. Here we have a plane crash, we waken in the water to find a lighthouse nearby to enter and make the descent into Rapture. And of course we get the speech that everyone more or less knows by heart who has played this game from Andrew Ryan. Yeah, I'm just going to let this play, of course.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, Rapture can become your city as well.
The way the strings swell up with the music as the reveal of the city happens, even just playing through it again and watching the footage for it while editing, it gets me every time. Such a strong intro. On the note of the voice acting, the game mostly knocks it out of the park, but Armin Shimmerman, who plays Ryan, is just the perfect fit and the standout. He's done a shitload of stuff, including being known as Quark from Deep Space Nine, which I didn't know for the longest time.
Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow?
I licked his boots like you couldn't believe. He loved me. I was his golden boy. I was on the high road to the top of the Ferengi business world.
During that playtest in early 2007, feedback gathered led the team to make some changes to this intro. Initially, there would be no portion prior to the plane crash. Instead, we'd just wake up in the water. This bit on the plane was added fairly last minute and helped establish the time frame with smoking on a plane. And with a short line, gives us more of a connection to our character, Jack.
They told me, son, you're special. You were born to do great things. You know what? They were right.
More sea vestas were put in place to make it clear that Rapture was underwater. Again, I wonder if Darkseid, Phil, and Aaron Hansen were playtesters here. So on the note of playtesting, yes, it's important, but sometimes I wonder where the fuck they get these people. This is something I come across whenever I read stories about playtesting. One example that always pops into my mind is listening to the Half-Life 2 Part 2 commentary from the developers. One player got lost in the antline maze for about 30 minutes, letting it to get squashed down. Of course, he was a Redditor. Some jokes just write themselves. Another one is from Dishonored when a playtester wouldn't go upstairs on the level because guess what? A guard told them they couldn't. There are some cases that came up in playtesting that do make sense for changing, but other things like the quest arrow I find pretty silly. One thing I see mentioned in conversation about BioShock is that the RPG elements were stripped back due to these playtests. This was not the case. I didn't find any information on this. They were stripping these back far before the playtest. Something that did come up as a result of the playtests were spreading out the plasmids across the first couple levels. At first it was very quick one after the other. So in this intro we get the rules of the world, the rules of Rapture. Of course this is a video game in the end, but a lot of time here is put to make sure things make sense in the world itself. The amount of detail that goes into this really helps BioShock stand out. What's with all the vending machines for ammo is why there's a civil war, of course. In a city where pretty much anything goes, of course people jump to this to make a buck.
Welcome to the Circus of Value!
On our radio, we'll have an Irish lad named Atlas guiding us through the world of Rapture.
Now, would you kindly find a crowbar or something? Bloody splicer, seal Johnny in before they... Goddamn splicers.
It's funny with this plasma bit here, he doesn't give any indication that we should do this or kindly do this at all. The first level here is quite linear, but it's more to explain the rules and how the world works, before the upcoming levels really start to open up. We also get to see our first Big Daddy in action taking down Splicer, though I do have to wonder why in this scene the little sister wandered off so far from her Big Daddy. But hey, it's a great dramatic entrance to show just how powerful they are. I mean, they could have just had this scene with the Big Daddy present, had a handful of splicers try to attack it, and met their fate, and that could have worked just as well. Still, it's just a fantastic intro to get the ball rolling. So each level of BioShock has a fairly central focus to help flesh out the world of Rapture, or the philosophy of Andrew Ryan in the city. The number of characters that we encounter throughout will be extensions of Ryan's character and reflection of his philosophy when it's taken to the extreme. Some characters will have their story play out throughout the various audio logs throughout the game, some will be constrained to just one level. Here in the medical pavilion, Dr. Steinman, the surgeon, is confined to mostly this one level. He's a showing of having no restraints of what kind of surgery he could do on others that push him past that point, becoming a Picasso of surgery, as he mentions. There is some great little bits of horror here and there, some of that System Shock 2 shine. Although I played this game enough to just turn around and swing here with this one guy, but sure got me the first time around. As I mentioned earlier with the plasmids and the tonics, we have a number of decisions, but we're also limited by atom. We can't get everything. Sure, we could spend our atom to get more plasmid slots. However, that takes away atom that can be used to upgrade our current plasmids or buy other plasmids or tonics. With that said, there's plenty of gene banks around so you could swap plasmids at any point, and rarely are you more than a minute or so away from one. Some also have more usefulness with environments, like electro bolts to get some switches to work or use on water, or using incinerate to remove ice. As the game goes on, these can be swapped for ammo that can do the same thing. On the note of switching between weapons or plasmids, if you use a controller, it's a different setup. If you want to do it with the keyboard and mouse, it still pauses the game, but you get this awkward shift away. Like the UI doesn't feel like it was the main focus. Of course, this comes from the time frame when consoles really start to get first priority. Of course, that Looking Glass lineage, there is a 0451 code here as well. In this level, we also get our first choice with the little sister of rescuing or harvesting. It's one of the few times that the game takes control away from you and into a cutscene. Ken Levine is not a fan of cutscenes as they take control away from the player, so it's used very sparingly here. The reason it's used in this scene is to really hammer in the choice the player has to make and make it as clear as possible what they're going to do. And on this scene, I also talk about subtitles. I usually turn these on for gathering footage, but also it's helpful here. What the audio diaries can sometimes be hard to hear in the middle of combat. Feels like a strange thing to complain about, but BioShock loves to show way too much text on screen for the subtitles instead of flipping through it. It takes up a fair amount of space, but also you could read ahead and see what's coming. The next level is Neptune's Bounty. I have to mention the excellent level design BioShock has. Save for the first level, which mostly serves as the tutorial section at the tail end of the game isn't just a linear path, it loops back into itself. This level is great showing of what happens in a city like Rapture. Even in a place where anything goes with the best and the brightest, someone has to be scrubbing the toilets. While he was mentioned briefly in some audio diaries in the previous level, it's here that we really get a lot more insight into the man of Frank Fontaine. Frank grew an empire the size to challenge Ryan. Frank Fontaine is dead, but he proved to be a real thorn in Ryan's side. While Ryan spends his time with the elite of the city, Fontaine is more for the working man.
You can't quit. Fontaine will find you. Hey, fuck Fontaine. Fontaine fucks you.
There's also a sad story we could come across through the environment and audio diaries here of parents losing their daughter into becoming a big sister. They end up taking their own lives.
We saw our Masha today. We barely recognize her. That's her, Sam said. You're crazy, I told him. That thing? That is our Masha? But he was right. She was drawing blood out of a corpse by Fontaine Fisheries. And then when she was done, she walked off hand in hand with one of those awful golems. Masha!
This is something that BioShock 2 would explore further in one of the better, more tragic tales of Rapture. Another gameplay mechanic I haven't talked about are the Vita Chambers. It's one of those other missed opportunities and one of those game issues. If you die here, you get resurrected the last one that was closest to you. It's similar to what was the case of System Shock 1 and 2. However, in those titles, you had to activate them on a level in order to make them work. Else you'd be met with a game over, and there's also a cost to doing them as well. Here, there's no real penalty. You don't have to worry about activating them. Hell, enemies will still have the same amount of health afterwards. So if you want, you can just go back to a Big Daddy and whittle them down if you're really struggling. Now, you could also deactivate these in the game options as well, in which case a death will just take you back to your last load. I wish they took the approach that was similar to System Shock 1 and 2, where you have to navigate a level first to find them and activate them. Some of my fondest memories playing System Shock 1 on unexplored level was playing with caution moving forward until I found a restoration bay, at which point I'd go crazy. On the City of Rapture itself and the whole idea of objectivism, with what the game covers, this isn't just a case of herd or capitalism bad. It's a city with a philosophy, a vision pushed to that limit, and the human condition of what happens. When writing the story, Ken used objectivism to explore the human condition. And of course, this didn't happen right away. Rapture was founded in late 1946, and we're now in 1960. Say it took time to grow to have a number of milestones happen and events. On this level, we get to learn more about the contraband and the rise of Fontaine, who invested heavily into adamant plasmids while Ryan was focused elsewhere. Many things from the above world were banned by Andrew Ryan, getting to the point where he was executing people over it. The reason was twofold. For one, he didn't want Rapture to be discovered, and two was to help escape the parasites they got away from on the surface. Still, things creeped in like Bibles, drugs, various kinds of alcohol. Whereas Ryan banned this, Fontaine saw the value in it and made a killing off of it. Is this also how some of the period music came in as well, or was Ryan more open to that? The game really wanted to hammer this in, they could record their own tunes in a similar style from Rapture musicians. Still, the period pieces do their job, and they're ones we're familiar with. Arcadia is where the game really starts to come together and feel like you get into that great flow. And it was also the same case during development. The little section at the beginning of the Tea Garden, the team mentioned that Ken felt it was the first area to really capture that next-gen feel. He cited it as an example of a great BioShock area. In this level, it's more of a case of what do they eat, or I guess really, it's how do they breathe. And that's from the trees, courtesy of Julie Langford. Of all the characters of BioShock we come across, Julie does come across as a bit under development compared to the others, but she serves her purpose in the story.
Julie, we made a business deal, you and I, did we not? Money changed hands. Let me read to you from the agreement. Section 3, subsection 4.
Mr. Ryan.
Ryan Industries maintains exclusive rights to the creation, use, and exploitation of the Lazarus Vector.
Like the previous two titles, BioShock loves to make use of what I call the but-therefore structure, which is fairly common in these kind of games. Objectives are rarely straightforward. As we go towards something, something will come up in the way that we have to take care of first. Of all the levels I was looking forward to revisit on this playthrough, Fort Frolic was on the top of the list, and for good reason. It's simply a masterclass of level design and the highlight of BioShock. There are a number of reasons for this, from the excellent level design to the creepy atmosphere. One of the main reasons is Sander Cohen. It's through Sander that we get to look into the art world of Rapture through the mind of one pushed beyond his sanity. In previous levels where we had Atlas and Ryan constantly talking to us, they're not a factor here. We get plenty of quality time with Cohen. He's one sick fuck as that one guy calls him, but he's such a great presence.
Oh, Cohen, you sick fuck, let me out of there!
I want to take the ears off, but I can't. I hop. And when I hop, I never get off the ground. It's my curse, my eternal curse. I want to take the ears off, but I can't. It's my curse. It's my fucking curse.
Jordan Thomas was the level designer here. He was also the level designer on the Shalebridge Cradle in Thief Deadly Shadows. I've done a whole video on that level itself. Shalebridge Cradle is one of those few levels to have an entire Wikipedia page devoted to it. To be honest, I'm surprised there isn't one devoted to Fort Frolic. Jordan Thomas would also go on to be the director of BioShock 2. In a game full of great moments, the Waltz Splicer scene is one of the highlights.
Fly away, little moth! Fly!
What I didn't learn until this playthrough is that the game cheats a bit here and reduces the health of splicers so you could take them down faster. This being so you could time it more to the music, so it's much more of a dance. Although my timing is a bit off here, but you get the idea. Jordan mentioned that he wanted a music selection to make it more like a dance, so he went to the sound team and they came back with Waltz of the Flowers by Tchaikovsky, and it's such a beautiful choice. It lasts just about a minute, but it always stuck with me for such a long time and one of my favorite stretches in any game. Another thing to note is upon completing Cohen's masterpiece, he comes down to greet us, opening the way to the next level. He doesn't attack us, so if you want, you kill him here or you just leave him. I always leave him here as he does show up later.
You'll find your path to Orion is now clear. Tell him Sandra said hello.
The next level, Hephaestus, is all Orion. He's constantly taunting us. This is where we get to see a man push to his limits of his city and of his philosophy. It's a great level, but it's easy to forget how great it is after what came before with Fort Frolic, but also what happens at the end of the level. Feels like we're building up to the end here to accomplish our goal of killing Ryan. And then there's the reveal. In one of the few cases in the game, it does take control away from us, but there's a reason for that being the case. We have the "Would You Kindly" scene. In such a short time frame, we get the reveal about who we are, the death of Andrew Ryan, and the truth about Atlas. There's a number of hints throughout the game about this build-up that are much more apparent on additional playthroughs. One of them is at the very beginning of the game. When we look at the package on the plane, we could see "Would You Kindly" written on it. And replaying this, I was struck just how long it's visible on the screen. It's about 3 seconds. But on that first playthrough, I didn't think anything of it, or I don't think I noticed it. Fort Frolic, we could go to Jasmine's room. We could gain a fair amount of insight into Jasmine and her pregnancy from Andrew Ryan, how Fontaine put her up to it, and how Ryan killed her. There's also the audio diaries about the Vita Chambers and the bathyspheres. These are only linked to those with the same genetic code as Ryan. Being his son, we have the ability to make use of them.
They keep saying plasmid reconstruction this and quantum entanglement and that, and they're both dead people come back to life. Bullshit! Of course, Ryan will only allow it to be tuned to his genetic frequencies for the testing.
During this scene, we also get the cutback of "Would You Kindly" of the various times Atlas had said that.
Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find it? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
I do wonder if they left it out how much of a difference it would make. It really does hammer it in. I don't think it's a case of players would have missed it otherwise. And with it, we have no control of our actions. That man chooses, a slave obeys, and Ryan dies by our hand, living by his ideals.
A man chooses, a slave obeys. Kill! A man chooses! A slave obeys! Obey!
Plus, the Vita Chamber, which is linked to his genetic code, is turned off, so he's not coming back from this. It's also a very meta commentary on player choice of free will. In the room before, it's spelled out fairly clearly to us. It's also something to wonder what would happen if this room was accessible afterwards of the reveal. Funny thing to note, before they came up with the "Would you kindly" phrase, they were going to use Excelsior. That was going to be way too obvious in conversation. "Would you kindly" just fits into a sentence nicely. Plus, whenever I hear Excelsior, I just think of Al Gore from South Park.
Thank you, class. Excelsior!
BioShock lives or dies on how well the scene was built up to and executed, and it still holds up beautifully. It's regarded as one of the best plot twists around, and for good reason. If you go look at a video on YouTube on the scene, reading all the comments just show how much the scene has resonated with players over the years, myself included. And Atlas, well, it turns out he's been Frank Fontaine all along.
Nice work, Bio.
There are a few clues throughout the game that the story of Atlas doesn't add up. There are some terms he uses that are quite American in their origin. There's also this poster of Patrick and Moira in Fort Frolic, the name he gave for his wife and child. He mentions that he brought Patrick and Moira down here, yet another conversation mentions he and Moira had their first date down here. As great as this build-up is about who Fontaine is and how he's this opposing force to Ryan and the revelation that Atlas is Fontaine, I do find he comes across as a bit of a mustache-twirling villain with that voice of his.
I gotta say, I had a lot of business partners in my life, but you, of course, the fact that you were genetically conditioned to bark like a cocker spaniel when I said, would you kindly, might have had something to do with it.
Now here's a case of playtesting going right. Initially, Atlas didn't have an Irish accent, but had an American Southern drawl. However, playtesters found him untrustworthy, so they switched him to an Irish accent. Here's a brief spoiler for BioShock 2, so avert thy ears for a few seconds, but Sinclair made use of this accent in BioShock 2, and I found him really untrustworthy. Yet in the end, he's a total bro who never turns on you. So now we're on the run from Fontaine. Now the next section of the game shifts away from Ryan. Now we're focusing on Tenenbaum, or Mother Goose as Fontaine calls her, and Fontaine. So yes, the game does have a noticeable dip in quality after the death of Ryan. However, there's still pockets of excellence. In a way, it's similar to System Shock 2, where there's a noticeable dip in quality upon leaving the Von Braun. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a letdown of what came before. Tenenbaum in what she represents is most of the game's heart, with her and the Little Sisters. This is something that the sequel will explore more, and one of the reasons I do prefer it. And since rescuing all of them, Little Sisters are very kind to me here. Tenenbaum herself is seeking her redemption after playing a part in how Little Sisters came to be, seeing what she's done, but also playing a part in how we came together. Fontaine is such a great juxtaposition to Ryan. While Ryan is an idealist, Frank Fontaine is reality knocking at the door. Ryan believed in a society that had no restraints, everyone would work towards their own goals that would improve society. Well, here comes Frank Fontaine to show otherwise. This leads to Ryan being steadfast in his beliefs at first, but starts to bend when Fontaine begins to challenge his empire. This in turn leads Ryan to do things against his beliefs, such as taking over Fontaine Futuristics after Fontaine fakes his death. It continues to build and build as he gets more and more isolated, more paranoid, more of a tyrant, and we see what happens to Rapture in its current state. Of course, if there wasn't Fontaine, there would have been someone else to oppose Ryan. For example, BioShock 2, there was Sophia Lamb. But just due to the juxtaposition, that's what makes Fontaine such a great foil for Ryan. But also, he's not quite as compelling as Ryan. I couldn't wait to hear a Ryan audio tape or have him taunting us over the radio. But Fontaine, well, his taunting is overdone, and he more or less says the same thing over and over with different words. If they cut the radio chatter in half with him, I think nothing really would have been lost. I do find some of his voice acting here to be a bit over the top. I think they should have went with a slow, calmer manner of speaking than what they went with here. That way he would come across less of a mustache-twirling villain. This level is fine. It's not as good as what came before, but still enjoyable. There is a good section where plasmids will cycle through at random and you can only get to use one at a time. So it's a nice little bit to get you thinking outside the box, and I found myself using plasmids that I wasn't using as much. And if you did spare Cohen in Fort Frolic, he makes another appearance here.
You're still testing your wings, little moth. Stay and enjoy the dance.
The last stretch of the game of the Big Daddies and Little Sisters is great. Well, most of it. We get an understanding here of how Big Daddies and Little Sisters are made. This is one of the more fascinating aspects of Rapture, and something that we explored much further in BioShock 2. For whatever reason during this section, Tenenbaum really ramps up the German side of her.
Shite! You let him get away! Oh, I need a moment for thinking. Of course. This will be no problem.
But then at the end, there's the escort mission. You know how escort missions tend to be, and this one is no exception. The little sister really loves to take her time. It's funny that they implemented this into BioShock 2, but in a way that was challenging and quite fun, instead of the dreadful slog that it is here. Oh, and then the final boss fight is, yeah, it sucks. This feels like something made by a completely different team with a looming deadline. Ken Levine has since apologized for it. For all the questionable game design choices that have popped up since BioShock's release, there are a few that have been positive. One of those positives is not every game needs a final boss if they're not designed around them. BioShock 2 corrected this, same with BioShock Infinite. And BioShock here really could have used this. As far as the endings go, Ken Levine only wanted one ending initially that was much more ambiguous. However, higher up suggested that they have a couple of endings. That said, I think the good ending is quite touching.
You gave them the one thing that was stolen from them. A chance. A chance to learn. To find love. To live. And in the end, what was your reward? You never said. But I think I know. A family.
With that, let's look at the aftermath in the wake of BioShock's release. This was an interesting point in gaming. Around this time frame is when the industry went in a direction that made it more of a commercial juggernaut, but plenty of stagnation on the creative front and consumer-unfriendly practices that continues to this day. The game sold extremely well and was adored by players and critics. The topic of games as art that loves to rear its head every once in a while was quite prevalent around the time of its release. The term ludonarrative dissonance, a term that makes many roll their eyes, popped up around this time frame as a result of BioShock. I didn't realize until now, but it was Clint Hawking who coined the term. Clint's work has been featured on this channel before, for he was the creative director of one of my favorite games, Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. In a nutshell, it's where the narrative is in conflict with the gameplay. One case being the Little Sisters. You could take the objectivist approach and harvest, or reject it and rescue them. As the rewards were so similar in the long run, there wasn't that issue of the player really struggling to come to a decision. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Ken Levine talked about this in an interview. They were going to make rescuing far more punishing, but the publishers balked at that, and had to compromise. The other case comes to our free will and with us helping Atlas. In a game about free will, why should we help him? Well, the game takes care of this by Atlas removing that free will of controlling us with Would You Kindly. I do have to know it's kind of strange that Atlas does gives us this option of harvesting or rescuing. He doesn't Would You Kindly us on that front in regards to harvesting. Granted, Tenenbaum may have been able to hear him over the radio in that conversation we have with our first little sister encounter. If he did say Would You Kindly there, she would have picked up on that. This topic of ludonarrative dissonance still pops up at various points to this day. Naughty Dog is pointed as a common case. Nathan Drake merely going about his way slaughtering hundreds of people. Or in The Last of Us 2, Ellie making a narrative choice in the ending that goes completely against the gameplay of what came before. As I noted earlier, BioShock released an interesting turning point in the industry. This was a 7th generation release. At this point, the 360 was just under 2 years old, PlayStation 3 and Wii were just under a year old. While the team that built BioShock was fairly small, most games at this time saw inflated budgets and team sizes due to the new technology. 2007 is one of the more noticeable years in gaming when it comes to games that were released. Now, there are two in particular I'm going to focus on for the long-term impact they had. Firstly, one of them was a new IP, Assassin's Creed. Yeah, remember when that was new? Since 2007, Assassin's Creed has had yearly release in the mainline series save for 2008, 2016, 2019, and 2021. This formula that started in Assassin's Creed that Ubisoft evolved in, it's more or less been the same for all their games over the last decade or so. This formula has sapped their way into other developers, where open worlds became more what I call checklist simulators, full of large worlds that are pretty to look at, but shallow underneath. And as of writing the script, the rumors of BioShock 4 included taking the open world approach. Hopefully it doesn't take the Ubisoft approach. And the other title? Well, 3 months later after the release of BioShock, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare released. The previous Call of Duties sold well, but Modern Warfare blew those numbers out of the water and became the behemoth that it still is to this day. Sure, it's had its ups and downs over the years, but they still sell an ungodly amount of copies and have yearly release cycles. We want the Call of Duty audience started to spread its way throughout the industry. Of course, there was the financial crisis of 2007-2008, with more emphasis on the long-term impacts from 2008. And of course, these ballooning budgets and team sizes, a financial crisis, publishers looking for the Call of Duty audience, the industry really started to go more commercial than creative. Microtransactions started to become the norm as well, even if they still are a few years off of really kicking in. Companies took less risks and relied more on surefire hits that catered to large audiences and sequels. And of course, there's the steady rise and growing number of consumer-unfriendly practices. Games broken at launch start to become more and more common. Hell, the release of BioShock in 2007 on the PC was a bit of a botch. I played on the 360 at the time, so I didn't get to experience this firsthand. What would happen to the BioShock franchise in this changing landscape? Well, the game would get a sequel 2.5 years later. There was some skepticism about whether BioShock needed a sequel. I myself was skeptical. BioShock 2 would launch to a positive but much more muted response. That said, its reputation has grown over time. I'm happy to talk with others who, like myself, view it as the better title. Sure, it didn't have a mind-blowing twist, and Sophia Lamb wasn't as compelling as Andrew Ryan. However, it had a more personal story that focused less on messing with your mind than tugging at your heartstrings. While the first hour was a bit shaky, the rest of the game was high quality the rest of the way through. There wasn't a noticeable quality drop later on. The gameplay also saw a number of improvements. As I said earlier, BioShock walked so BioShock 2 could run on the gameplay front. Another strike against BioShock 2 is that Ken Levine would not be involved. With the release of BioShock, Ken Levine became, for better lack of a term, a game developer rockstar, in a way similar to people like Kojima. Instead, Ken would have free reign to do whatever he liked, which led to the tumultuous development of BioShock Infinite, a game that would not see release for around 5.5 years after BioShock. The industry would see a huge change in between that time frame. And while BioShock would go on to sell well and have critical acclaim, it's a mixed experience. I don't think time has been as kind to it, but that's for a future video. Winding down, BioShock is a fantastic game that still holds up wonderfully. It took the foundation of titles like System Shock and streamlined in a way that still mostly held up its ideals, but reached a massive audience. It has a strong focused narrative that has one of the best plot twists around, and marks the tail end of what I call the golden age of gaming, the late 90s to mid 2000s period. It's a title that continues to be widely adored and discussed to this day. Ken Levine became one of those figures that, with his name attached, became a big deal. Besides a few peeps here and there, he's been quietly working on something since early 2014. What that is? Well, just as I was finishing the script, rumors are the upcoming 2021 Game Awards may finally show off what he and his team have been working on. That, or the reveal of the Game Awards, may also be BioShock 4, or both. But there's reason that people have been waiting patiently over the years for anything on this front. It just goes to show the impact that the world of Rapture has had on people. And what about Columbia? Well, that will be a talk for another time.